Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've had a good lunch and are feeling refreshed and revived. And just a reminder that the morning sessions, the breakout sessions, you will get a chance to hear what was discussed in all the sessions at the end of towards the end of the afternoon. But we're going to crack on with our program this afternoon, which is about the ecosystem of trust. And we've got a great lineup of speakers coming up. In other words, what kind of regulations and legal requirements do we need to ensure a trustworthy AI? So we're going to be debating this in our afternoon plenary session. And then there'll be more deep dive sessions to go deeper into how we do regulations and the whole issue of trust. But to set the scene, I'm very pleased to welcome Roberto Viola, Director General of DG Connect. Roberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anya. Good afternoon to everybody. I hope you can see me and hear me well. So it's really a pleasure to be with you for this afternoon session and a pleasure to be with the AI Alliance. If there's someone to blame, so to say, for the Alliance, it's me and my team. So as if someone to praise for being part of the Alliance, it's you. So I hope that we all agree that this idea at the beginning of the journey on artificial intelligence in Europe to set up an alliance was really a good one. And I think today's event and the lively discussion demonstrates that I think it is a good idea. Not it was, it is, and it will remain a good idea in this long journey we have ahead of us. And the day is organized a little bit like the white book that we have published on artificial intelligence, with this idea of the twin ecosystems, an ecosystem of excellence that we very much need. And you have debated this morning. And this afternoon, the other twin, the ecosystem of trust. And let me say right away, one doesn't exist without the other. It cannot be that, there is AI excellence without the people's trust. It cannot be that there's people trust on something which is not perfect or excellent. Perfection, unfortunately, is something very difficult or even philosophical, but excellent, yes. So the two things very much go together. And we need to have the best of the best when it comes to research, testing, new developments in AI, but we also need to be the best when it comes to how people should feel, live, and experience artificial intelligence. We have been leading in the world, thanks to your work, in terms of fostering this idea of human-centric AI. We were the first in the world to say that. We have set up an high-level working group and the alliance that you represent. We have been, if you allow me, when it was still possible, traveling around the world, explaining what we had in mind. And now we are traveling in a virtual way around the world to say what we mean by human-centric AI. And I think when we say we mean it in Europe, that's a bit the difference of some other parts of the world. They say human-centric AI, but I don't think they really mean it. So I think our work has led to many, many reflections around the globe. And since our code of conduct, which has been a premiere, it has been raining codes of conduct around the world. But I come back to the point that I'm sure you agree with me. Words must have a meaning. Words must correspond to something in terms of behavior of our society, which we believe. And that's why, when we say words like trust, we say words like human centricity, we say words like respecting fundamental rights. I think in Europe, and that's the difference with some other parts of the world, we really mean it. And this leads me to the consideration whether in such a moving environment, as such a dynamic environment, we do need regulation. And what is the difference between having a code and having regulation? Clearly, the difference is that when we move into the space of regulation, we move into a space of something which has a legal form and some legal certainty. So, do we need this step or not? This was the fundamental question when we explained our meaning of ecosystem of trust to the various stakeholders that responded to our white book. It's rather impressive to see that more than 80%, and it's nearly 90% of respondents said yes to this question. Yes to the idea that at least without constraining innovation, but some things are a bit more clear. And also, it's very interesting to note that the European leaders, the heads of state and governments, when they met last week and they discussed the digital future of Europe, they asked the European Commission to come up with a clear definition of this high-risk artificial intelligence. So, thoughts from the political leadership, respondents, everyone seems to converge to the idea that the rules should not be constraining. Rules should be horizontal, but at the same time make a little bit of clarity also from the legal point of view, how to treat artificial intelligence in the society and the economy. And I mean, from what has been asked to us by the leaders and from what is the way we have approached the problem, the way we got responses from everywhere, this idea of a risk-based approach. So this idea of trying to identify areas where there are risks about our safety or fundamental rights. So we need caution. And all the other cases where artificial intelligence is an enabler to do things better, but without, being so different from any other product or innovation. So this kind of distinction, a risk-based approach, and this kind of pyramid that you can imagine, there are a very large number of applications that do not pose particular problems. There's a more restricted number that we need to watch carefully. And then there's a little bit on the peak of this pyramid, those applications which might be really, really problematic. So this is the way many of you have described the risk-based approach. And I think it's a very effective way of looking at things. Now, will it be simple to arrive to a definition of what is high risk? One might say, well, it will be extremely complicated because risk can be at times a bit subjective. Well, I think, and this will be probably the debate you will be having this afternoon, there are also objective criteria to identify the risk. And again, the work of the high-level group and our white book is pointing in some directions. And of course, first and foremost is the safety and the risk that something can pose to life of people. The second area is, as I said, the area of fundamental rights, when the harm is so diffuse and so relevant that you can consider a certain application something to watch. And I think this, let's say, broad category needs to be, of course, delimited and restricted to really what could be considered damaging in the sense that it takes the human centricity from the other way around, and it's a system that becomes machine-centered rather than human-centered. And a clear example would be a social scoring system utilized by public administrations in Europe. I think, beside the individual horror that we might have individually, I think there would be some fundamental issues, some fundamental questions, which one has to really ask in front of such a scene. And the first fundamental question is, a human-centric system has the fundamental characteristic that the people are owning their future. The future is in the hand of each of us, and it cannot be predetermined by a machine. The other element is that we enjoy equal rights in our democracies, in our societies. And these equal rights cannot be jeopardized by the choices of a machine. We cannot accept that there might be a bias towards one or the other person when it comes to having a job or being selected to go to a school. So all of this, of course, are not simple questions, because you might say that also humans do make choices. Humans also do make selections. So why we should trust more humans than machines? Because we are a human society, and because a human-centric system trusts more the humans than machines by construction. Now, I don't want to open a philosophical discussion that will last for weeks, but I just want to stimulate the discussion that when we say things like human-centric, respect of fundamental rights, now is high time that we give meanings on this word. And also, as the European countries have now requested, the leaders, we also start to define things. So, and of course, I have an easy task today because I just state the problem and I don't give solutions. But the reason is very simple, because there's a panel and the solutions are from you. And for me, it's just to pose the problem. So I still like to enjoy, at least for today, this kind of comfortable role. But believe me, we, of course, are ready to work, to engage with you and to go further into this very important journey for the future of Europe and the humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Director General. And yes, well, you have got me thinking there with a lot of philosophical thoughts, and I'm sure we will have a very good discussion this afternoon. Time now to hear from our keynote speaker, Professor Katharina Zweig from the Algorithm Accountability Lab at the Technical University of Kaiserslautern. She's been a professor of informatics there since 2012, where she set up a degree course on socio-informatics. Katharina Zweig is an advisor to various government ministries in Germany, including the Enquete Commission on Artificial Intelligence of the Bundestag. She's won numerous awards for her work and has just been announced as one of 2 AI ambassadors for her work and for the state of Rhineland-Palatinate in Germany. And last but not least, she's a prolific author of countless journals and also books, including a popular science book, which is called An Algorithm Has No Sense of Tact, and that's become a bestseller in Germany. Now, Katharina is here, but just to be absolutely sure, we're going to play a video of her speech, and then hopefully there'll be time for a couple of questions afterwards. So, Katharina Zweig.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm happy to be here and talk to you about regulating and controlling ADM systems in a differentiated approach. So when we started working in the Enquete Commission on Artificial Intelligence, we were given a speech by the President of the Parliament, Dr. Schäuble, and he said, "Artificial intelligence is seen by many as the new magic spell of technical progress." And then he went on to tell us what it might be able to do. And he said, it will create poetry, and it will reward, and it will punish. And I think that actually these are the 2 fears that people have when talking about AI. The 2 fears are that it will be poet, that it will replace us in our most human activities, and that it will relentlessly judge us. And so the question is, how can we make this judging trustworthy? And how can we decide whether we want machines to judge us or not? So I want to concentrate on AI systems that do that, because boy, have we seen some judging AIs in the last years. So one of the most prominent cases is certainly the use of software to predict grades on exams that have never been written. A multitude of AI systems that judge employees by their hireability or their likely success in the future. And last but not least, AI systems that are said to be able to predict whether a criminal will commit another crime in the future or not. So are these trustworthy? And if not, how can we make them? How can we find out that they are not? How can we improve them to make them trustworthy? That is the topic of my talk. So I will concentrate on these algorithmic decision-making systems that have an algorithm at its core, take humans as an input, and either score them by some perceived risk or classify them according to some predicted behavior. How do the decision rules actually get into that core algorithm? There are mainly three ways. So the first one is that the decision-making rules can just be implemented by a computer scientist, or they can come from experts, be compiled and transferred into a computer understandable structure, or they can be learned from data. And again, I want to focus on this last group because this is where strange things can happen. So I just want to give you a visual impression on how many people are actually involved and how many institutions are involved if an ADM system is being developed and employed. So we have researchers that do the mathematical parts, we have data collection in other parts of the society normally, then we have a person called a data scientist that selects data and the mathematical method. Then we have the system and somebody feeds in data, somebody else interprets the results and takes a decision of the action, and there might be some feedback. And all of these phases have their problems that can render the resulting system non-trustworthy. So let me give you some examples of how AI's decision, if learned from data, can be wrong. They can be based on the wrong data or on incomplete data or erroneous data. They can rely on correlations rather than causal relationships. I call this algorithmically legitimate prejudice. They can be too bad to be used in a specific circumstance, while they are good enough to be used in another situation. So face recognition in a confined setting with good lighting can be very well used, but might not be usable in public transport situation. They can be trained wrongly for a given application. So the system itself is fine, the application itself is fine, but there's no match between the two. They can wrongly discriminate. And these are only examples of what can go wrong in this long chain of responsibilities and the many phases of developing such a system and using it. Of course, there are also possible countermeasures. So on the one hand, you can strengthen the trustworthiness of such systems by giving more information about them, by creating some transparency. On the other hand, we might also want to have an external validation of this information. So we could ask for information about input data, its completeness, the error rates, and similarly. We could ask for information about quality of the resulting decisions, or information about the mathematical method being used, what exactly was optimized. And also these are only but a few examples. If you want to go deeper or need to go deeper and want to validate the information, we need access to data to be checked for completeness and error rates. We need access to the ADM system to validate the quality of resulting decisions. And as a last resort, we might also want to have access to code and the resulting statistical model. However, that is far less useful than most people think, and it should really be a last resort. And again, there are other ways to that need to be granted to allow for external validation. So many people ask me, will this not inflict a problem for trade secrets? Actually, no. In essence, if done well, none of this will reveal trade secrets. We have other situations in which financial secrets are concerned, and we have found ways to secure them. Something similar can also be done with respect to this for algorithmic decision-making systems. So I hope you saw that I restricted the set of ADM systems for which I think that we actually need control to a small set. So what is this set? My hypothesis is that ADM systems need to be regulated, normed, and/or controlled with respect to this logic mechanism, the inner working of the technology and the quality of their decision-making, basically only if they contain a learning or a learned component, because expert systems are inspectable by humans by construction. If that component makes decisions that can actually inflict some damage, and independent of whether a human is in the loop or not. How much insight and control of the decision logic is then necessary? I think that this needs to be differentiated by, on the one hand, the total potential individual or societal damage of using the AI system in a given social context, and the dependency of the scored or classified subject on the decision. So based on these two dimensions, we think there are different classes of ADM systems being used in a given situation, and the access to the different countermeasures should be related to this classification. So what you see here on the x-axis is the question for the potential damage, and on the y-axis you see the dependency, and we think there's a class 0 of ADM systems where we don't need control or insight. And on the other hand, there's a class 4 where we shouldn't use ADM systems because we can't make them trustworthy in their decision making. And in between, we see different combinations of these countermeasures that could be required to better understand whether the ADM system is trustworthy or not. So, in my view, as a computer scientist, we need to minimize the regulation and always check whether they pay for one of two rationals. What I see as a computer scientist is that we need to build a market for trustworthy ADM systems in which the extra effort is paid for. I have countless anecdotes of how easy it is to sell a badly done ADM system to governments or to industry. And it's hard to understand whether they are trustworthy or not. So there needs to be a market where the extra effort is paid for. The second rationale is to enable a lawsuit where individuals, legal persons, or the society as a whole assume that they have experienced a significant damage by the use of an ADM system that made decisions concerning them. So as I said, without looking into these systems, it might be very hard to understand whether there was a damage or not. And on the other hand, we really need to minimize the regulations. So we wanted to get a feeling for how many of these class 0 ADM systems are there, or AI systems. And what we did is a preliminary study on 127 AI systems that stem from a German database on the platform learning system of our Ministry for Research and Education. And in this preliminary study, we found that about 60% of the AI systems in this database were quite clearly in the class 0 segment. So they don't need any additional regulation, and any additional regulation would hinder innovation in these sectors. For the other 40%, most of them were already in already heavily regulated sectors, e.g. health or safety. So we do need to concentrate on those ADM systems that actually can inflict harm or damage. So this is my proposal for a differentiated approach. I think that we need to differentiate between ADM systems used by the state and those by other organizations. So ADM systems used by governmental institutions need to be classified according to the risks, and the results need to be transparent. This should be mandatory. There needs to be a group of independent experts to regularly inspect these systems according to their risk classification. However, even a governmental check board might still be in class 0, where no extra control is necessary. But a classification of the unemployed for hireability might be in class 3, where regular inspection and evaluation is necessary. So other usages of ADM systems require, technically, from what I said, the same risk classification and state-of-the-art development and deployment to avoid and mitigate harm. But I wouldn't see a need, as of now, for making that mandatory or public. So I would encourage companies and users of ADM system to make such a risk classification and to communicate and document that they did a state-of-the-art development. However, this only is checked and evaluated if a lawsuit is ongoing or in preparation that needs access to this information to fight their case. And of course, the access has to be granted after careful consideration of possibly conflicting rights and inflicted costs. If then it turns out that the risk classification was not well done or the system was not built by state-of-the-art theories and tools, then this should have a consequence for using the ADM system. So I think that only in this differentiated approach we can do what all of us want. AI made in Europe that is innovative and trustworthy. Thank you very much.
Well, Katerina, that was a very thoughtful presentation of yours. I suppose the first question that comes to mind is that why should there be a difference between the public sector and private companies?
So if you've seen my risk metrics, then you see that we go for potential damage and dependency. And it's quite clear that if the state uses an ADM system, we have both. We have strong dependency, there's no alternative where we can get our ratings. And there might be the potential damage can be much higher because there's such an asymmetry between the powers of an individual and the state. And so very often these ADM systems will be in the lower corner where we need more insight and transparency.
But do you have examples of things going wrong with private companies using this system at the moment?
So there's also potential for that, of course. So especially if AI is used for employees to assess their hireability or the fit to a job, then of course we could see discrimination there. We could see all kinds of things going wrong. And we hope that unions will be able to work together with their employers to make sure that these systems are trustworthy as well.
Katerina Zweig, thank you very much for your really insightful presentation and lots of food for thought there. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So on that theme, we're going to continue now because this morning we heard from the chair, Pekka Ala-Patelia, on the inception of an ethics strategy and framework to create a trustworthy AI. And to support those guidelines, the group, the high-level expert group on AI, has produced a tool to help organizations navigate the very complex issues they face in developing and implementing AI technology. So to tell us more about that, I'm now joined by Barry O'Sullivan, who's the vice chair of the high-level expert working group on artificial intelligence, and his day job is chair of constraint programming at the Department of Computer Science at the University College Cork in Ireland. Barry, thank you very much. First of all, why did you feel the necessity to develop a tool for other companies and organizations to use?
Yeah, so good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. Well, of course, this is an effort from the high-level expert group, as Pekka will have mentioned this morning. The history of this is that in the first year of the work of the high-level expert group, we produced the ethics guidelines for Trustworthy AI, which went out for consultation to the European community, specifically around the form of what would be an assessment list for evaluating the trustworthiness of AI systems. Essentially, that work was done over the summer of 2019 to give us some insight into what that list should look like. And what the high-level expert group set about doing was developing a tool for a set of tools, an assessment list that companies could use for assessing their own work. Consumers maybe might be able to use it for assessing the work of others. And ultimately, we published that earlier this year. Now, the high-level expert group felt that a useful thing to do as well would be to create an online version of that, which we produced, which essentially is available in an open source manner for the community as a whole to adopt and extend and to use in their own environments. So that's the history of it. And I suppose why we need it. Well, you know, companies are very, very good at assessing how they conduct their business. You know, AI is largely an engineering process within a technical tool chain, and companies are very good at ensuring that what they do is of high quality. There are, of course, other dimensions that need to be considered, like the ethical dimension, which is what we do through the assessment list. And so this tool is not in any way just to replace what companies are already doing, but to complement and add value where that's going to be helpful and useful. And so that's what we've been focusing on. So I can show you the tool in a few minutes, but essentially, if anybody's interested, they can give it a shot and see how it looks and get some experience of the kinds of considerations that the high-level expert group had in considering what are the important aspects in evaluating AI systems.
Actually, that would be very useful if you just could share your screen and just talk us through some of those thought processes and some of the aspects you looked at.
Yeah, so basically, let me just do that right now. So you should be able to see the screen right now. Hopefully, you can see that. If you want to access it, you can access it at altai.insight-center.org. And we tweet that out, and the organizers will also tweet that out. And this is essentially what the tool looks like. So I suppose I should say that the tool respects very, very closely what the high-level expert group produced as their assessment list. And I suppose what's key in this is the 7 key requirements for trustworthy AI. And I think we're very proud of the 7 key requirements because, you know, today we've been talking a lot about the ecosystem of trust and the white paper that the Commission produced earlier this year. And you would see in the white paper those very same 7 key requirements. When someone uses the tool, essentially you create, you can register on the system, you create an assessment list for your own product. So for example, I just started to create one here for a project we're working on matching, it's a carpooling application. And so we can just view that. And essentially when you enter the tool, you're basically asked to comment on the 7 key requirements. And so human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy data governance, and so on. And you know, in selecting one of these areas, essentially what the tool does is it takes you through the work that the high-level expert group did in terms of what the important issues are under each of these headings. You know, you go through a set of questions which you can complete. You'll see here that there's some blue text just to help you get some, you know, what do we mean by end user? What do we mean by a subject? What do we mean by an AI system? And so you can explore that. And as you complete this, so is the AI system designed to interact, guide, or take decisions on human end users? Then yes. That, depending on how you answer this question, further questions are asked. So if it doesn't generate confusion for some of the end users, could it generate confusion? So let's say no. As we complete this, we're asked more detailed questions, and in some cases, we're asked to provide some documentation. Now, what's important to point out is that this isn't a system that is rating you. This is the system that's going off, and it's not itself an AI system that is going to be untrustworthy. It's basically a tool to help organizations to self-document and to self-reflect on the nature of trustworthiness as they work through their projects. You can, of course, at any point decide that you want to no longer focus on this section, and you might want to instead, well, it's going to complain at me because I haven't completed everything, but you can focus on some other sections. Ultimately, what it does at the end of the day is give you a summary of what your own self-assessment is of your of how well you do. So let me just click through some things here just to give you a sense of what happens. I'm just randomly clicking at this point. So let's just, so we've done all those things. Did you consider? Yes, we did. Did you provide us a data collection? Yes, we did. And so sometimes you hit these red boxes. And so based on so this is where companies get to rate themselves. And so how would you rate the privacy and data governance measures and procedures you've set up for the systems? And you might say, well, they're adequate. And you can submit that. And what's happening in the background is the system is generating some recommendations of things that you might want to consider. It's creating a summary report of how you score. And this isn't shared with anybody else. This is entirely your own work for your own use. And there to help companies document what they're at. So at the moment, this tool is sitting on our university website. It's available to everybody to use, but it will be available for for companies and organizations and others to take it and to make it their own. Obviously, what we would not like to see is that people change the spirit or the substance of it, but maybe extend it in ways that are relevant to their organization. And ultimately, what we want to foster is a culture of trustworthy AI that where companies, in particular SMEs maybe, that may not have the resources to do this kind of work. This is a way of helping them and getting them on the ladder to trustworthy AI. And it's something I think that the high-level expert group is particularly proud of. And the importance of the tool, I suppose, is to make the experience of the assessment list something real and tangible that people can get a sense of how this works and what this looks like.
So yes, you say it shouldn't replace existing systems that people use for compliance, etc. But
sure.
Don't you think it could be the gold standard one day?
Well, I think if I can blow the trumpet of the high-level expert group, I think we have had 52 exceptional individuals working on the high-level expert group who have consulted with the European public on 2 occasions and have taken that feedback very seriously on board. And I think what was produced is something that is the state of the art. I think the work of the high-level expert group is, in my view, the best piece of work on ethics for trustworthy AI around. And why I think that is, I think it is unique in how it's gone from high-level ethical principles to key requirements. And then it goes one step further and shows how to operationalize those key requirements through an assessment list. So obviously, what I'm showing you on the screen here is a tool version, a web-based version, but there's documentation that the group produced that people can work through, and there's explanations for the various texts. So I think it is the first, and I think still the only complete approach to trustworthy AI, from ethical principles to how you implement it and actually really do it in the wild, so to speak.
Thank you, Barry. I suppose it would be worth somehow sharing the link for that. Where yes, would people find it?
Well, of course, it's on the AI Lines itself. So people can go to the AI Lines and find the assessment list of trustworthy AI. It's also on altai, altai.insightcenter.org, and we tweet that out. It's on various materials that have already been circulated, or just simply searching for it in your favorite web browser will get you there as well.
Great. Thank you very much. That's really interesting and very informative. Thank you very much for that.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So with that, we're going to go now to our panel discussion, which is an ecosystem of trust, do it right. Basically, what kind of regulations and legal requirements does Europe need? So to discuss, I'm joined by Iban Garcia del Blanco, who's a member of the European Parliament, Spain. Mr. Del Blanco is the rapporteur for the European Parliament report on the ethical aspects of artificial intelligence, robotics, and related technologies. And he's recently been nominated S&D coordinator to the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in a Digital Age. Cecilia Bonefield-Dahl is the Director General of Digital Europe, the leading digital technology industry association, representing over 35,000 digital companies in Europe. Mislav Malencia is the president of the Croatian AI Association. His biography says an AI engineer and entrepreneur focused on building emotionally intelligent AI solutions that have a positive impact on the world. And Ursula Paki is Deputy Director General of BEUC, that's the European Consumer Organization, which represents independent consumer organizations from 32 countries. We also have Andrea Renda, Senior Research Fellow and Head of Global Governance, Regulation, Innovation and Digital Economy at CEPS or CEPS, a leading think tank in Brussels on EU affairs. And Christiane Venderhorst, and she's a professor of law at the University of Vienna, and her main area of research is European private law, since recently with a special focus on challenges posed by digitalization, such as the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence and the data economy. And she's been advising governments and legislators at EU and national level. And finally, we have Irini Zafaratu, and she's the head of the European region for public policy at Amazon, leading teams in the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Poland, Brussels, Luxembourg, and Turkey. So welcome everybody to the discussion. Before big wave there. Before we carry on, though, I just want to include the audience in this, and I've got some more Slido questions, and I'm going to be asking the panel similar questions, but just for the audience. On Slido, do you think that regulation should be limited to high-risk AI assessments? Let's see what people say. Well, yeah, absolutely. Pretty much like, oh, it's going up. No, it's not. It's actually, well, I won't wait because Slido always takes a while to make up its mind, doesn't it? But it does look like the majority think that regulation should be limited to high-risk AI assessments, which is pretty much like the result of the public consultation, which also thought that. And let me ask you the second question for our poll. An AI system sorts through written applications and recommends who should be invited to a job interview. Do you consider this a high-risk AI system? So an AI system that sorts through written applications and recommends who should be invited to a job interview. Is that high risk? Let's see whether you say yes or no. Well, it looks like most of you do think that is a high-risk AI system. So that kind of social impact type thing that we were hearing about earlier is considered to be high risk. So with that in mind, I'm now going to go to our panel discussion and see what the panel think. And I'd like to start with Iban Garcia del Blanco. What do you think would be a high risk system that needs regulation?
Thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, I hope that you are all safe in these tough times, and good afternoon to everybody is seeing to us. Artificial intelligence represents a great opportunity for the Union. However, they can bring serious consequences for individuals, groups, and society as a whole. It will therefore be necessary to reflect on the legislative responses in order to share the benefit and to prevent possible risks drawn from their potential. The European Parliament report on a framework of ethical aspects for artificial intelligence, robotics, and related technologies is striking the right balance between promoting trustworthy AI, we were talking about this topic all the time, and promoting and supporting innovation in Europe. We are proposing a technologically neutral and future-proof framework that is fit to adapt to the evolving nature of AI technologies. Our understanding is that all AI systems in the Union must follow a human-centric approach, safeguarding human dignity, autonomy, and safety, and should respect fundamental rights and Union law. Regarding risks, the European Parliament stated a definition of high risk based on an objective criteria. Any technology that could cause injury or harm to individuals or society in breach of fundamental rights and safety rules is laid down in Union law will be considered a high-risk technology, taking into account that the sector where the technology is developed, deployed or used, the specific use or purpose, and the severity of the injury or harm that the technology has the potential to cause. The risk assessment of artificial intelligence, including the software, algorithms, and the data used or produced by such technologies, shall be carried out in accordance with the objective criteria mentioned before. The European Parliament proposed an exhaustive list providing examples of high-risk sectors and uses or purposes, not technologies. And I'm glad that all the people listening to us are agree with us that in any case, things like recruitment procedures are absolutely on the high risk, under the high risk category. Taking an example, the AI systems used to recommend the best candidates for a job, employment is among the sectors considered as high risk, and recruitment is one of the potential high risks. Therefore, any AI developed, deployed, or used in the Union for the recruitment of employees is to be considered a high-risk technology. Hence, their development, deployment, and use must comply with stricter legal requirements to ensure its safety, transparency, and accountability. The data should be non-biased, non-discriminatory, socially responsible towards gender equality and workers' rights, respect privacy and personal data law, and ensure that governance standards take into account stakeholder views, including social partners. Consequently, in our proposal, we did not set out specific criteria for banning any particular technology. Any AI technology, even when we consider high risk, should be developed, deployed, and used in accordance with fundamental rights and Union law, and with the ethical principles as laid down in our proposal for a regulation.
Thank you very much. I'd like to bring Ursula Packel in there. Do you agree with the audience that there should only be regulation of high-risk AI? That's the starting question before I go on to ask what should actually be regulated.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much for having the consumer voice in this panel as well. So my first response would be, no, we don't think it's a good response to address the problem that the Commission suggests, which is a binary approach to have only high risks regulated and to have only certain sectors regulated. We think that there should be a much more differentiated approach, maybe similar to what Professor Zweig just explained, a more open approach. And if you like, I can give some examples of what we think, how regulation should approach these applications.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I would, of course, concentrate on applications that are used by businesses for commercial uses, right? So the first group of applications which we think is problematic and highly problematic are biometrics. I think everybody would agree to that. So our principal approach would be that these should be avoided for commercial purposes, following a precautionary principle approach. And that means that they should be banned, to answer your question, if there is a real impact, a negative impact on fundamental rights and maybe also consumer rights, like on privacy, data protection, or a huge potential for consumers being misled. And that should be assessed by a risk assessment, a really rigorous risk assessment that looks at necessity and proportionality. I give you an example. Use of fingerprints in supermarkets for payments. So we would ask, is that really necessary? Is it necessary to use fingerprints to achieve the objective? The answer would be probably no. Is that really proportionate? Is it really that degree of interference into these fundamental rights of privacy, of security, etc., that is really balanced with regards to the protection that is at stake? So that's how we would see that. Depending on the result of that risk assessment, that should be then the decision, can that technology be applied in this way or not? Second example I would like to provide is in the sector of insurances. That's a sector, for example, that is not mentioned in the white paper as a sector that could be regulated. We know the insurance sector is moving towards what they call behavioral policy pricing. And that means that in addition to, for example, in car insurance, the data of how the car behaves, we will move to a situation where it will be very much observed how the driver behaves, right? This is very important, you think, if it comes to a distracted driver who causes an accident. So real world data will be collected all over the place. Same could be for health insurances. Healthy lifestyles should be avoided by cheaper premiums, etc. So the question is that really necessary that we interfere in such a way in the privacy of the insured person, in the way they decide about their lifestyles, in the way they decide about what they do? So influencing the behavior is really a very problematic issue that is much easier now with AI technology. So that could lead to fairer and more affordable premiums, for example, but it puts into question the whole principle of insurance, which is solidarity of a certain risk cluster, which is how we have dealt with insurance so far. But there is a big, and I would really like to underline that, a really big societal question behind. Do we want to move even further into a society where we are permanently under commercial surveillance? Is that what we really want? And I think that is really a value judgment that should be done there. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, I just wanted to come back to you there because you're talking about a precautionary approach. Do you actually have examples of where some of these systems might have already done harm?
I think we have a lot of harm that is already done in the field of digital advertising, which is based on algorithm-driven recommendations that consumers receive in terms of their attention is captured by recommendations or by advertising that is placed. And you may say that is maybe not a direct economic harm that is done to consumers, but it can easily lead to that because we know that these algorithms are sold already with the objective of influencing consumer behavior, and that can easily lead also to a situation where consumers are excluded from accessing certain services or products or at individualized prices, which consumers, and we know that from surveys, they hate not to have the feeling that they get a fair deal from the market, that their neighbor pays the same price, that their friends that they get the same as their friends get. And we're moving into such an individualized market. And that would be a big harm, not only individually, but also, I think, collectively for us all.
Okay, before I move to our next speaker, just to ask them about the idea of what should be regulated, I just want to bring in Cecilia Bonefield-Dahl there, because you represent Digital Europe, and we've had some criticism there of digital companies, and I just wondered what your perspective is on that.
I mean, I do agree with Ursula as far as there are certain applications that need to be treated with caution. So as long as we apply a risk-based scenario of what is the risk really, I mean, we have a very strong consumer regulation already in place in Europe, and we have very strong anti-discrimination rules, fundamental rights, really taking care of a lot of the things already. But of course, there can be, for example, facial recognition used. I would say it's not only commercial, but actually also even more in government use, that we have to be careful about how it's used. But as long as we approach it with a high risk, and we also give the opportunity to the consumers that are actually getting the benefits of AI, I mean, I think it's a part of the way going forward that we have tailored offers from different vendors, as long as there is a transparency in how. And this is actually something that our industry is working very much with already. I mean, we have a very good self-regulation system, and many of the companies are very far in documenting, you know, how things are actually going on. So I would say we are in the forefront of our sector already compared to many other sectors exactly in this area.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Christian Venderhorst now, from a legal point of view. What do you think? What would be an AI system that needs to be regulated?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on this panel. From a legal point of view, I would like to draw a line between AI systems that mainly pose physical risks on the one hand, and AI systems that mainly pose social risks on the other. Physical risks, which are also often called safety risks. They are risks caused by unsafe products and activities involving AI. Now, this concerns things such as the safety of self-driving vehicles, drones, or medical and care robots, and of liability, of course, where damage has been caused by the operation of such devices. Now, while AI may add to the risks created by such devices, the risk as such is of a very traditional type. In other words, other technical developments could have a similar effect on physical risk, and the effect on a victim is probably very similar, irrespective of whether the traffic accident that killed them was caused by AI or by any other vehicle component. So that leads me to the conclusion that the criteria that have led us in the past to classify particular devices as high-risk devices and create particular regulation for them should still be applicable in the AI age. So very much like we have classified, for example, medical devices as deserving particular regulatory attention in the past, that should still hold true in the age of AI. And of course, the medical device regulation does include software, and it does include AI. Now, likewise, if you look at liability, there are, a number of applications that have already led national legislators to create strict liability regimes, such as road traffic vehicles or bigger drones. And that should be the same, basically, in the age of AI. Of course, we need to look more closely. We may have to extend these strict liability regimes, but this will largely be necessary for digital technologies that move in public spaces, that have a certain minimum weight, move at a certain minimum speed. So I'm thinking about AI-driven delivery robots. I'm thinking of bigger AI-driven cleaning robots in public spaces. I'm thinking of bigger AI-driven lawnmowers. And these are similar to the fields where we already have special regulation. But that is just the physical side, maybe the less interesting side. So what is much more AI specific and what is new is social risks. And they're also often called fundamental rights risks. So this is discrimination, total surveillance, exploitation, manipulation, in general loss of control caused by inappropriate decisions outsourced to AI. And this is where we have HR software, personalized pricing, personalized news feeds, predictive policing. And this is what we normally mean when we talk about the new risks created by AI. And there we may need new criteria to assess risk. Now, I could, be very short and just refer to what Katharina has said in her keynote. Of course, risk is always a combination of the severity of harm that might be caused and the likelihood that the harm will occur. And there's been a number of systems have been developed to assess that risk. And I think they all have in common that they're not, they don't look just at one factor. They look at a multitude of factors, such as the significance of the legally protected interests, the level of potential harm, including non-material harm, the number of individuals affected, the total figure of the harm, and the overall harm sustained by the society, because the risks are not only individual, they're also societal, they're collective in nature. The likelihood that harm will occur depends on the role of the algorithmic calculations in the decision-making process, the complexity of the decision, the effects of the decision, the reversibility of the effects. Now, these are all factors that need to be taken into account. Katharina has presented it. The German Data Ethics Commission, which I have had the privilege to co-chair, also has developed kind of a matrix for that. By and large, I agree with the approach taken by the white paper, but very much like Ursula, I have to say that I'm not at all convinced by that sector-specific approach. I think what counts as a high-risk application shouldn't depend on the sector, such as whether it's healthcare, transport, or energy. We should only look at the individual application. And that means that for me, something like human resources management, allocation of education places, credit scoring, personal pricing should always be considered a high-risk application, irrespective of the sector in which it happens to be employed.
Is there something you would ban?
Well, that's a very difficult question, actually. I'm often asked that question, is there any AI you would ban from the outset? I think any kind of AI application that creates unacceptable risks and fails to mitigate them should be prohibited. So, on the other hand, if you restrict the purposes and take measures to mitigate the risks, there's hardly a technology that you cannot use under any kind of circumstances. For example, there has been a lot of discussion about the ban on facial recognition. But banning facial recognition altogether, never mind for what purpose and under what circumstances, is maybe not a very good idea. That would mean that this technology is only developed outside Europe. So very much as Ursula has just said, you need to look at the individual purpose. You need to look at the precautionary measures that have been taken. And, this is all that you can do basically is identify certain areas where you have candidates for banning, and an area where you find a lot of those candidates is probably public surveillance, is probably lethal autonomous weapons. But again, I find it very difficult to focus on a technology. I think you always have to look at the application.
Thank you. So, Ursula, I just want to put to you some of the points raised there. Today, we're discussing creating an ecosystem of excellence, an ecosystem of trust for European AI. But some of these technologies are already out there, and we are subject to news feeds, all sorts of things, other facial recognition systems developed by other countries. So what's the solution? Are we talking about creating regulations just for European AI, or does it need to be much wider than that?
Well, that's a very important question, obviously, because I think I was a member of the high-level expert group on AI, and I think the idea that brought us together there was really to create really let's say, the Brussels effect, right? That means really creating something which then can really spill over globally and really lead to a high level of protection and to a high level of trust, to that trustworthy AI systems that the high level group has advocated for. And so I think we have already quite a number of examples where the European Union could really, with its regulatory approach, could really influence global standards and global commercial standards and behavior. And so I think we have to do the same here. And it is very important that we are assertive about how we are doing that, and that it should be seen as a push for innovation and for competition if you manage to create systems that people are not worried about, that people can really use without having concerns. And we know that currently we've just done a survey with consumers in 9 countries, and indeed the level of trust is very low that consumers have. It's on many different aspects. It's on interference with privacy. It's fears about being manipulated by automated decision making. It's fear, and that's also an important point, that authorities cannot control these systems. So people are worried about a market that has gone out of control. And I think that's very justified. But with an assertive approach to regulation accompanied with a strong enforcement system, I think that can help a lot to address the situation.
Ursula, thank you. I'd like to hear the view of a couple of businesses we have with us. First of all, let's hear the perspective of Mislav Malencia from Croatia. We heard there about the consumers' suspicion and fear about AI. With that in mind, what would a risk-based regulation mean to you and businesses in practice?
So what I would say is that I think we're doing an awesome job when it comes to regulating mature businesses and mature technologies. But I think that we are not creating enough space for entrepreneurship and innovation. And I just don't see it in this paper. And maybe I can start with sharing a story. 12 years ago, I went to Silicon Valley and I came there and claimed that we have the first legal virtual currency in the world. And people there said, legal? Who cares if it's illegal? First, try to move $100 million with it, and then we'll sit together and we'll decide, does it create value or it poses a threat for the society? And then we'll figure it out, should we make it legal or not? So the idea is not to stop the innovation. The idea is not to stop testing and so on. The idea is actually to find a balance. And right now, when we are talking about these either high risk areas or low risk areas, I just don't think it's very easy to find a line. I think we are just creating an environment where there's a lot of uncertainty around liability issues. So if you're an entrepreneur, innovator, if you're trying to start a startup and you're thinking about Europe as a good place to be, and I think that Europe has a lot to offer because we have our European core values that we can actually basically export, especially to US and China. Right now, you as an entrepreneur will just say that the cost of innovation here is very high because you don't know what's regulated, what's not, will you be able to comply or not? And that's something that's very important, basically, that we address. Otherwise, we'll just push out people out of Europe.
Thank you. Irini Zefiratu, do you agree?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for a predominantly female panel, if I may say so, starting by our presenter, but with a good diversity. So thank you for this. I think I agree with many of what has been said. I would echo a couple of points. So the first was, as has been said by the professor and by the Director General, we need to look into in particular the usage of specific risk applications. And I'd agree with Christian on that as well. So the usage of certain applications is what we need to look into. And there are a couple of good examples have been mentioned, even within a specific sector or a specific high risk application. There are applications for good, and people mention face recognition for finding children, for example, as opposed to general face recognition for surveillance of everybody. So you can have different usage of and different cases there. So we need to look into the specific cases and into the usage. The second point I would make is we need to consider the whole value chain, and so we need to see that you have particular possibility to look into this from the developer's perspective. So when those applications or usage cases are being developed, but also from the deployment. And then I go back to Christian's point about the deployer's responsibility, right? So when someone deploys the case and the application, how is this being done in order to minimize any potential issues? So I think these are two important points. I would agree with Mislav that artificial intelligence exists since several years, and I wanted to say how we use it at Amazon since 20 years, since 10 years. So in the industrial organization of logistics, we are using, for example, artificial intelligence or machine learning in order to know where we're going to place the products in the warehouses so that they can be easily and environmentally friendly transferred to the customers. So given how many millions of items exist out there, it is totally impossible to continue doing these things manually. So the organization of the whole logistics chain is a good example of how machine learning and AI are being used. But also, when customers go on online shopping and on the internet, how to make any search or any decision unless you have some type of system helping you sort out what you're looking for. So these applications have been out there. There's been a lot of innovation around those. And I'd also agree that the specific usage cases that we're looking at here that have been named by all the speakers, such as human and fundamental rights, danger of life, specific surveillance and law enforcement and governmental surveillance of the population. These are things that we need to put the risk assessment on and to look at. But I totally agree that the work we've done over the past 2 years, together with our partners and allies, and with the Commission to produce guidelines and the assessment list, is a very comprehensive work. And so I would look into that and take also the lessons from that. But I would totally agree with Mislav that we should not create even sector-specific regulation of AI, but we need to look very specifically into usage and into deployment.
All right, thank you. So I'd like to bring in Andrea Render here. Andrea, would you like to comment on the sector-specific regulations? And also, I suppose, Mislav's point that all these new regulations are just creating extra red tape.
Well, yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me. It's good to see so many friends and former colleagues in the high-level expert group in this panel and throughout the conference, and also happily being a minority with female co-panelists. They tend to be smarter, so I'm very happy because it makes it for a much better conversation. So, in terms of the sector-specific approach, I tend to agree. It's very difficult to single out specific sectors. Even if you take one intuitively high-risk sector, which could be healthcare. Within healthcare, there are a number of AI applications that are not necessarily generating immediate risk, and there might be sectors that are a little bit less intuitively considered as high risk, I don't know, logistics itself or others, in which some AI applications can actually generate disasters. So I would say the overwhelming majority of the people that have commented also on the public consultation have rejected the sector-specific approach. Let's look at the applications and let's try to come up with a proportionate regulation, which brings me to your second question. How do we make it proportionate? Well, here it is sort of a combination of very complex elements that make me actually conclude very often that what we're trying to do here is one of the most ambitious attempts to regulate a phenomenon ever made. And one of the reasons is that AI is very pervasive, and that AI will be increasingly pervasive. And there is also a sort of a Pantarei effect, if you wish, that when we try and look at the subject matter and try to find solutions for what we see in the markets today, we should take into account that by the time these rules will finally land on the market, the world and the market where AI is applied will have changed, and will have changed very significantly. So I'm happy to get back to this later, but a degree of foresight, I think, is extremely important there. How do we avoid creating red tape? Well, first of all, is to try to avoid a binary approach, and I think this has been echoed by many others, when we have a bulk of regulatory requirements that refer to different aspects of the potential trustworthiness or non-trustworthiness of a system, and then a sort of a high-risk, low-risk system that, when a system is high-risk, activates all the requirements at once. I think this is something that we should try to avoid, and I will try to explain why. Also, going back to what Professor van der Horst was saying before, there are two main categories of risks that today we identify with respect to AI. One is the more sort of product safety risks that are obviously altered by the introduction of AI in many respects, and they fall typically within the liability of the producer in most cases, but with the need for a number of changes. But there are also other risks, which Professor van der Horst has referred to as social risks or risks for fundamental rights. Now, there is a fundamental difference between those categories of risks. The ones related to safety can be, to some extent, not to full extent, but controlled, monitored, and anticipated at the time of the development of the AI system. So when someone is designing and developing the system, most of the social risks depend not really on the lab, but on the field, meaning when someone takes an AI system and starts deploying it in practice, and the system starts interacting with other AI systems and human beings, some of the risks that could not easily be anticipated emerge. And in most cases, having a high-risk category for AI systems that conflates this two, and then makes a specific type, for example, of conformity assessment applicable all across the board for all these aspects, is potentially a way to create some disproportionate regulation here and there, and it's a little bit surgical in the way in which we try to address the regulation of AI. There's another reason why I think we should try and avoid being over-comprehensive, at least at the very beginning, in trying to classify high-risk AI systems. And there's, if you allow me, Anya, makes me become a little bit more on the pragmatic side. I tend to be on the philosophical side, but here I'm very pragmatic. We're not ready. We don't have the skills. We don't have the notified bodies. We don't have the governance mechanisms to control 60% or 40% or 50% of AI systems on the market, ex ante, ongoing, and exposed. So we need to be, at the beginning, very careful in singling out those applications that clearly generate risks, and put in place a dialogue, a discourse, where some of these applications that might end up becoming high risk are adequately identified and subject to a proportionate set of regulatory requirements. I'll stop there, obviously, but if you have questions, I'm happy to get back.
Yes, well, there's a question in from the audience. I'll ask you first and then ask some of the other panelists. So AI is in a phase of exploration and appropriation. Don't you fear that an over-regulations is hampering innovation in an international context of competition? So all this talk about regulation, shouldn't we be getting on with it?
Let me try and be telegraphic as much as I can, which is not much in general. But first of all, and then I'm happy to be challenged on those statements, okay? So I'll try to be telegraphic. First of all, Academic literature, research has proven, I think, abundantly that regulation is not against innovation when it's properly timed, adequately stringent, and well crafted. Regulation is a bliss for innovation because it gives direction to innovation. And in a context in which we are trying to mobilize our resources to achieve resilience and recovery, particularly in Europe, we wouldn't want to spend all our resources on AI applications that don't lead us anywhere towards those objectives. I mean, I wouldn't put public funds on Netflix's recommendation system or on Huawei's better selfie, if you wish. Nothing against the companies themselves, but the thing is, we might want to focus on those applications that are more oriented towards resilience and sustainability and human-centric applications more generally. Secondly, the global competitive landscape does not really show shiny examples. Meaning the Silicon Valley model that was quoted is really in deep crisis in many respects. That is not the type of capitalism that is evoked today as the one that will lead us towards sustainable over time, which is our goal. Our goal is not AI, right? Our goal is prosperity in the long term through AI if needed. And on the other side, of course, authoritarian regimes also don't offer shiny examples of how you build a balanced approach in this respect. So I think regulation can be a very important element in the building and in the crafting of a vision for human-machine cooperation towards prosperity that I think the European Union at this moment, as things stand, interprets better than most other countries around the world. We only have to get it right now. It's not going to be easy, and we're going to need two main ingredients in order to do this, if you allow me, Anya, on which I think I would like to echo what Roberto Viola was saying before, not really on the content, but on the philosophical approach. I'd like to quote Immanuel Kant there, when he said that the thing that really create wonder for us are the starry heavens above us and the moral law within us, right? We need, in order to interpret this vision, to have foresight, the same that we need to have when we look at the starry sky, and imagination, and at the same time, to be really, really wary of the moral principles that make us human and that we want to preserve in the creation of the society of the future.
Thank you. Well, Mislav, what do you think? Overregulation is hampering growth, and what do you think of what Andrea has just said?
Well, I think that it's super hard to regulate something that you don't understand. So if we are saying how to regulate innovation, something that did not happen so far, or how to see the future, and then how to create like the best possible framework so that this future is, that we never make a mistake in this future, I just don't think it's possible. And I think that the best frameworks are usually formalized based on best practices. And right now we are not creating enough space for actually trying some of these things, maybe in controlled environments like sandboxes, but definitely not by saying that right now we see the future and that we can actually create the proper framework that will actually save us from all the possible mistakes. Because part of the innovation is actually trying and actually like doing mistakes and then learning from these mistakes. And right now, I think that if we, for example, take a look at the list of like top 10 most valuable companies around the world, we'll see that many of them were actually startups like 10, 20, or 30 years ago. And basically none of these startups comes from Europe. And I think that we need to also to admit to ourselves that if startups are vehicles of innovation, Europe is right now not a world-class environment for startups. And mainly because of our mindset and our mentality, which is like mainly focused on what can go wrong instead of like being inspired with like what we can really build and how can we actually really engrave some of our European core values into products that we can then offer to the rest of the world.
Okay, thank you. Cecilia, I think you want to come in there. You've got something to say.
No, I just wanted to say, Andrea, very well said. And also, Misha, I mean, we right now in Europe, we have around 5% of the world's unicorns, although we are one of the richest and biggest continent in the world. It's quite worrying. And I do think we are treating AI like it's a danger on everything. We have maybe the safest continent or I would say the safest continent in the world, very, very well regulated. And until we have an evidence-based approach to risk, then I think regulation is really a little bit, I would say, what do we regulate? I do agree totally with Irene, and that we have to look at the application of it. What are the situations where it really poses a risk, and really limit ourselves to that? To me, I mean, for companies, I mean, there's no company that wakes up in the morning thinking, I'm going to damage someone. And if they do, it will have consequences in market. Consumers, customers will not have them as a partner. Where I see one of the biggest risks is really government. As long as you have a good government in place, nothing is wrong. When you don't have a good government in place, well, there you are in trouble. And time of time, this has been shown again in history. So for me, I mean, let's really look at the usage. Where are the high risk areas of usage of the applications? And if we have an evidence-based approach to this, then let's have a discussion on the concrete cases on where we really need additional protections. Of course, that's the case. But I do agree with Michel. I'm sometimes a little bit frustrated that we are discussing, how to impose further horizontal regulations on Europe in time where AI could really boost the economy after the COVID crisis, and where AI could really help us to find solution actually to prevent another pandemic, or at least to predict some of the consequences. So I think we need to start focusing on adding our values, exactly like Mislav said, into the applications, build our products in a way that we can also offer solutions on some of the world's problems. And then last not least, I was very happy to see this morning that 14 countries actually signed up to this approach in a letter, in a position paper, saying let's do evidence-based, risk-based, and let's boost the economy, the AI economy, of course, with care that we already have. If there would be gaps somewhere, let's cover them, but let's identify them before we start, building new fortresses around innovation, and not to let it happen.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we could go on talking about this subject. I want to move on to another topic now, and I want to look at the requirements for high-risk systems. So the Commission published a communication welcoming the 7 key requirements identified in the guidelines for the high-level expert group. And just to remind you, they were human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, societal and environmental well-being, and accountability. So what do you think, which legal requirements do you believe for any of those categories are particularly important? So I would actually like to go to Iban Garcia. Are you still there? I'd like to ask you what you think.
Yeah, I'm still here. And it's so interesting, the debate. And first of all, please allow me to say that I absolutely agree with Mr. Renner. I think that a good regulatory frame, it has to be, in fact, a tool to boost the development of the technology. But trying to focus on the question, I prefer rather speak about our own report that is so new in this way. And I think that we have to establish some principles and requirements that for me are all as important one to another. First of all, human agency and human oversight, including a stop button when needed, the famous red button. Highest standards to ensure safety, transparency, and accountability. The data and outputs should be fair, non-biased, and non-discriminatory. Personal data, including biometric data, should be gathered, stored, and preserved, guaranteeing privacy and fundamental rights, notably in compliance with the GDPR. And gender equality and environmental fairness are also laid down requirements to ensure a social and sustainable, responsible AI. The compliance with all these requirements are equally important, as the breach of any of them may result of a substantial risk of causing severe injury or harm to individuals or society. That is my point. I think we have to take everything as a whole. No?
Okay, thank you very much. Let's ask the same question then to Christian Venderhorst. Again, which of those categories do you think we need legal requirements for, which are particularly important?
Well, again, let me draw that line between the physical or safety risks and the social risks. So if we look at AI applications that largely pose physical or safety risks, such as self-driving vehicles, drones, or medical or care robots, and also associated risks like cybersecurity risks, I think we should concentrate on technical robustness and safety, and of course then accountability, and the rest will follow automatically. So put bluntly, we do not primarily need manufacturers of autonomous cars to explain to us, maybe in a very transparent manner, whom they prefer to kill, and to prove that the ratio of individuals with light skin color they killed matches exactly the ratio of those individuals in the overall population. So primarily, we need them to develop autonomous cars that are safe and that will not kill anybody, full stop. And of course, when checking the safety and type approval procedures, we will then check whether the sensors work reliably without regard to skin color and so on. And once we detect any kind of problem there, we simply deny type approval. It's as easy as that. And even if we rightly point to the fact that sensitive choices are made when designing AI, the same holds true, of course, for many other design components. Look, for example, at the heavy gender and age bias that may be inherent in the size of car seats and the positioning of airbags. So by and large, I think it should not be our primary focus to extend measures such as information duties, rights to receive explanations, and so on, to AI applications that largely pose very traditional safety risks. I think this is where, a risk-based approach means, stay with the existing criteria which we've become familiar to. However, of course, when we have an AI application whose focus of risk is on the fundamental rights side, such as those HR software, personalized pricing, and so on and so forth, I would say that probably all these 7 key requirements are very important. And this is why they're key requirements, because they are all important. However, having said that, and coming back to our previous discussion, I'm fully in agreement with various speakers that we must not overdo it. And I'm wondering whether we should even stop using the term regulation and rather speak about framework, or maybe legal framework, but framework, because what we have usually called regulation not only has a limiting function, it has an enabling function, it's a driver of innovation, and it creates certainty if it is good regulation. And I can refer to what Andrea has said, there's good and bad regulation. And we simply, and this is that leads us back to the basically the header of this session. We need to get it right. So let's look at how do we get regulation that improves innovation and that creates a Europe that is an area for innovation and growth while preserving a very high level of protection.
Thank you, Ursula Packel. Which of those categories would you prioritize, if any?
Yes, thank you very much. It's may I say, with all respect, it's not a good question, because these requirements, when they were set up, they were meant to be equally important, depending, of course, and again, as Christiane just has said, depending on the application and depending on what for the application is used for. So from that point of view, I think it's difficult to differentiate and to make a ranking of importance. But what I would like to say maybe is that, and that's also to answer a little bit to what Mislav said, because he mentioned in the very beginning that it's a bit it's difficult for small companies and startups because there is unclarity, for example, about liability when you use these type of AI systems, etc., etc. And I think this is exactly the point, because what we see currently is either there is legislation already in place, for example, on transparency when it comes to consumers. How do you have to inform consumers? How do you have to inform about the rights when they have a right to object, to be objected to an automated decision making, and so on and so on. There is a lot of unclarity. When it comes to safety, there is a lot of unclarity of the current legal framework. How does it relate to self-learning systems? Because normally they must be safe when they are put on the market. What does it mean in regards to the life cycle of these systems? How do we legislate? How do we adopt legislation? Because in many aspects, we have already legislation, and that's, I think, what Cecilia said in the beginning, and I think businesses should care a lot about that. It is unclear how, as a business, I can really comply with that legislation for the reasons that I tried to explain with some examples. And then there are areas where there is no legislation in place yet, but we think there is a real need to have, for example, a good system to ensure accountability and oversight of automated decision-making systems, because currently I think, and I have tried to demonstrate that with figures that we have, in general, people think that authorities are not in a good position to understand what is going on in the market, to control if there are infringements against fundamental rights, against other rights, against legislation in general. So that needs to be really addressed in a legal framework, if you want, that there must be powers of authorities to control risk and to control output and to control what the applications are used for and how they are used for. And there must be accountability in terms of there must be assessment by companies themselves, there must be transparency, there must be reports, etc. So I would say transparency towards consumers, transparency towards the public, towards authorities, and enforcement, accountability, oversight. That is certainly something that is missing currently, and the rest needs to be updated.
Okay, I want to move on to our next topic very quickly. So the remaining 4 speakers, I'm going to ask you to answer in a minute each, if possible. So what do you think, Mislav, about that list, and what legal requirements do you believe are particularly important?
Well, I think that the idea of trustworthy AI, that's an awesome idea. So why behind that idea is awesome. The problem is like when we move from why to how, and then we just create a lot of things that, for example, entrepreneurs and especially startups, they just don't have resources or way how to understand. So we will have to be accountable for, are we creating value? Are we doing harm? And not accountable for, are we following all the rules that we just cannot follow and understand? So I think that the core idea is awesome, but the problem is when we are too early trying to move from why to how. So we are trying to prescribe things that we still don't understand, or we still don't see it in practice how they work.
Okay, thank you. That was nice and brief. Irini Zeferatu.
Yes, absolutely. So, as we discussed before, I think some of those requirements are good for some of the use cases and some others. So it's going to be hard to apply all 7 of them regardless. And so the way I would look at it is obviously you will need to apply for example, human oversight and accountability on some of the use cases that we discussed. For example, on facial recognition, there shouldn't be totally always autonomous decision of the system. By contrast, if you could apply that to automatic translation of languages on the websites, that could also be counterproductive for the purpose of the innovation. But I would also repeat that we need to look at the responsibilities of the deployer versus the developer. as I have said, when you try to design some good tech that is going to make the car autonomous, maybe the developer has something more to do there. For some of the other use cases, you will need to look at how the deployer does things. But I would say, to close with, that the requirements for high-risk systems, for those, we have a good starting point already in existing legislation. So I'd look at medical devices regulation. So new medical devices that use artificial intelligence might not need a separate artificial intelligence regulation, but we can get a starting point from existing legislation and assess the additional high risk. And I would leave it there with that.
Thank you for that. Cecilia, if you could be quite brief before we can go on to the implementation round.
So if we look at the requirements, first of all, I agree they're all equally important. I mean, and I think Barry right before showed the assessment list. The assessment list is really meant for people to ask themselves the right questions when they develop or deploy AI. And I think that's a super good start. And I hope this tool gets out and really becomes deployed in governments and companies and institutions. And this is also the European way. We actually believe that we if people get the right tool, they will use the right tool. So this could be the first step to a European way. The tool exists, the questions exist, and it's taken 2 years to make it from a big group of 50 people. Second, if I look at the components, I would say a lot of the framework, the legal framework, is in place for all of these. We have GDPR, we have privacy. I mean, the fundamental rights. We cannot discriminate. There are two. You can say a legal framework, or you can say a framework for transparency. I mean, it's something that most of the AI companies or most of the tech companies are already working on. They are documenting, they are learning how to document algorithms. So maybe a self-regulatory system, or starting a process on how to create standards of documentation could be a way forward of improvement, but still the same risk-based. We have the regulation, and we're not inventing the wheel here. I mean, the risks are still for the majority of cases the same as always before, and we have addressed them. So I would say all are really equal, and some of them are extremely well covered. This was really a framework for trusting people with a tool to assess their performance or their approach to AI, whether they are in government or in companies. It applies to both and could be a first step towards a European way of doing this.
Thank you. European way of doing this, Andrea?
Yeah, I would agree with Ursula that this is probably not a good question to ask to someone that has been in the high-level expert group. We would stand. It's like asking someone who believes in the Bible which of the 10 commandments is more important. Although there might be some degree of prioritization. Now, what I will say is that, first of all, one clarification and then one attempt to tell you what I think is quite important or quite worthy of attention. The clarification is the 7 requirements are only related to one of the components of Trustworthy AI, which is the ethical alignment, right? And go in the direction of the socio-technical robustness. They do not deal specifically with the universe of legal compliance, so the lawfulness part, which obviously is something that then changes on a sector-by-sector basis and also as a result of horizontal regulation. So it's also a very flexible framework. So if properly implemented, if a company is not generating significant risks with an AI application, it takes 2 minutes to go through the ALTI, the assessment list. Obviously, if the questions then trigger a more complicated reflection, then it's something that it's supposed to really generate that level of internal reflection of the type of risk that one can generate while deploying AI systems. And if I had to choose my favorite, not really my favorite, but the one I want to focus on here for the regulatory or the policy framework, for me, it's human oversight. And the reason why I choose that is that, first of all, the high-level expert group, I think, has done quite a meaningful job in trying to explain that oversight can be arranged in various ways depending on the context. human in the loop, on the loop, human in control. So the level of responsibility in the act of delegating something to an AI system might take different governance and organizational decisions and arrangements. Now, that said, what I think is a little bit difficult to conceptualize in the forthcoming policy framework is whether human oversight should be a regulatory remedy, so one of the remedies foreseen by the white paper, or should rather be a way for a developer, deployer of AI systems to mitigate risks so that the AI system that has meaningful human oversight is actually not classified as a high risk. So it's actually an ex ante thing, or it's an exposed remedy once an AI system has been deployed and thereby triggers specific organizational changes. So to me, this is a little bit more complicated, and this is why I picked this one as perhaps the one that most, more than others, represents our need to really get it right, and at the same time stimulate reflections on the appropriate level of human-machine coexistence and cooperation when AI systems are deployed.
Okay, thank you. Now we've got 15 minutes left, and I just want to talk about implementation and bring in a question from the audience, which is once EU requirements for AI are released, who should enforce them? Self-assessment, a new EU agency, competent authorities, independent third parties, someone else? We have lots of different types of regulations in place. We've got anti-discrimination laws, we've got product safety laws, GDPR, just to name a few. Okay, I'm going to ask Iban Del Garcio this because I know you want to bring in a new regulatory body.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, we designed in our report a system based in national authority supervision. So we have to make sure that this is in harmonization with a non-fragmentation framework, and for this we plan that at the European level might have such a supervision by the European Commission. From my point of view, it might be such an agency or thing, a body like this. And this is not the opinion at the end of the rest of the groups in my committee, but I think we have an open space afterwards to the Commission to choose for one option or another. So we have to avoid the fragmentation, but we have to rely on the 27 national supervisions, just trying to make an environment coordinated. That is my point in this matter.
Okay, Cecilia, do we need an external body?
For what?
Well, to oversee regulations.
Well, honestly, I don't think so. So at this point, I don't. I mean, it seems that it's a very not very well defined task to have. I think we have many regulatory bodies in place for the regulations that we do have. I think we are still discussing a risk-based approach without really knowing what risk we are monitoring. When we have a scope of something that would be potentially something to oversee, well, then we can have a discussion on how to oversee it.
Well, how do we ensure then that high-risk systems are being monitored properly?
What are the high-risk systems?
Well, you've got to define that, haven't you?
Exactly. And that's exactly my point. So let's define what the high-risk areas are, and then we discuss afterwards how we approach them.
Okay, Ursula, where do you stand on this?
Yeah, thank you for this question, because I think we all see now that with this new economy or the digital single market, whatever you call it, that this question of governance and enforcement has become a crucial question. And there are so many big question marks related to it, not only with regards to AI, but also we have now the digital the Digital Services Act, which raises similar questions of how do you manage enforcement in a market that is very often European and not territorial in terms of the national member states' jurisdictions? And how do you find a good, efficient approach to enforcement in such a scenario? So I would say we would tend to say there should be specific bodies to deal with that, depending on the need of compliance. It could be centralized at a European level, or it could be decentralized at the national level. And of course, there should be a big linkage between the two levels. What we think is also necessary is certainly a pool of expertise, where, for example, the Commission or another centralized body could help national authorities or could help centralized authorities to deal with questions, because that will be, I think, decisive. But just to say, we should have taken the lessons from the GDPR, where the enforcement system has some very obvious flaws, and we should really concentrate on that question to make sure that authorities can enforce what the regulation will come with. Thank you.
Christiane van der Horst, do you have a view on this?
Yes, sure. So I think there are two aspects to it. The first one ties back to what we said about risk-based. I mean, once we have defined those AI applications which we want to be covered by the new regulation, we still have to take a risk-based approach within that scope. Meaning that probably we cannot, there's no one-size-fits-all solution, so we cannot just apply the same control mechanisms across the board. There will be some applications that are more at the lower end of the risk scale, and there probably self-assessment will be absolutely sufficient. And then there are some applications that are at the upper end of that risk spectrum, and there I think just self-assessment isn't enough. I think we need to have strong supervision there, and this is maybe a point where I disagree a little bit with what Katharina said in her keynote. I'm not sure we can make a clear public-private divide. I mean, I do agree with the point that dependency is really important, but I think there are also many cases in the private sector where you have that dependency, either because there's market concentration at the level of the deployers. For example, credit scoring is something that is done only by very, very few players in the field. So basically, if that one player or those two players have a bad algorithm, you're doomed. And then there's also market concentration on the developer level. So even if there may be thousands or hundreds of thousands of e-stores, if they then suddenly all use the same price algorithm, you may have a problem on a very big scale. So I think there are some really some cases where you may wish to look at it from a supervisory authority's view. That having said, we have to also answer the question, should there be a new body? Should there be a new authority? And I'm a big fan of a more sectoral approach. I think we have a lot of authorities already. So, and if an authority is in charge of a particular sector, they need to be in charge of that particular sector, and they need to look at the AI that is in that sector. So I'm not a big fan, of creating huge new horizontal structures, but we may need technical support centers. It's also not reasonable if each of the supervisory authorities has the full team of, top IT experts and AI experts. So I think you need a horizontal structure for support that supports those sectoral authorities in doing their job well when it comes to AI.
Okay, now we've got 5 minutes left. So I know some of you want to come in to say more on that, but we can't. So I'm just going to go round the table now, or the virtual room, and take a final thought, takeaway thought from you. But I'll start with you, Mislav, because you wanted to give a startup perspective to the last argument, and perhaps you would like to give your final thoughts as well. Very short, please, 1 minute.
Okay, so what I wanted to say is that AI is a tool as any other. So basically, I think that you already have a framework, what's good and what's not good, what's allowed and what's not allowed. And AI is maybe a little bit more sophisticated tool, so maybe we just need to raise awareness about like what will lead to certain biases and so on, so that people understand it, so that we are supporting them not to make mistakes instead of punishing them for something that they maybe did not understand up front. But if I would need to actually just to wrap everything up, I would just say we need to create more space for entrepreneurship and innovation, and to recognize that startups are the vehicles of that innovation. And that's something that, with all these messages about like premature optimization in terms of regulation, I think that's something that's stifling innovation right now in Europe. And we should be more brave and more inspired with what we can do, and create environment like testing facilities where we can actually test or sandbox environments and so on. So for me, it's more about let's be inspired and let's not be paralyzed with things that can or definitely will go sometimes wrong.
Okay, Irene.
Thank you. I think to summarize, I'd repeat really that artificial intelligence is an extremely broad term and should not be regulated. The framework should not be regulating this broadly. So really, I don't believe we should have entire sectors categorized as high risk. We should rather look at the use cases, the specific use cases we discussed. And the requirements can be important for some of those and less important for others, depending on the use. And also, please always consider in the total value chain, the deployer and the developer responsibilities. On the point of implementation, because I didn't have the chance to say, I think there are very many requirements that are already implemented in some of the sectors. So self-assessment and self-certification could be a solution for some of those areas where we already have good frameworks. And I would finish on an optimistic note and say there's a lot more opportunity than risk, and we can solve all of our health, sustainability, food waste, and many other challenges with the right effort and with the right mindset using artificial intelligence as well.
Okay, Andrea, more opportunity than risk.
Obviously, it is a very powerful family of techniques, and that expands potentially the reach of human intelligence, and will certainly lead us to do things that we had not imagined we would be able to do so far. But I think we have to be simply careful. I mean, Europe has the opportunity now to translate a very consolidated tradition, the ability to regulate also digital technology into principles. And this, I think, should be clear in the forthcoming framework. The process, not necessarily regulating everything up front, but what is the process for then deciding the governance? And in this respect, I do think that there should be some governance mechanism, maybe not a very heavy one or an agency immediately, but the more the subject and the scope of the regulation will go in the direction of conformity assessment, the more we will have to think about an agency, obviously. But say the governance follows the scope and the content. I don't think that with a relatively proportionate approach, we would be ready to establish an agency immediately. That is my impression. The other thing I think we should, and on this I disagree with the keynote, we should resist from the AI made in Europe idea. We should talk about AI made according to European principles. We shouldn't shut the door to AI made elsewhere. I think it would be a self-defeating choice on the side of Europe, because Europe has the legitimate ambition to set standards for everybody at the global level, and it's successfully entering that game. And finally, I don't want to also, I'm very supportive of startups, so Mislav is there. I don't want to sort of target you, but in my final statement, I think Europe is doing decently and quite well and could do better with startups and innovation. But we should also resist the temptation of looking at the top 10 largest companies in the world by saying European companies are not there. I have discovered that this size is not necessarily compatible with democracy in some cases, with a sustainable and balanced market mechanism, and even with, let's say, a lack of a blatant inequality in society in many cases. So I would actually say Europe should start cherishing a little bit its approach that is a little bit less oriented towards big size firms, but is a little bit more oriented towards equal opportunities on the market, if we manage to do so, so that everybody gets a fair chance to reap a proportionate part of the value that is created in the digital economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Christiane, can you be very brief, please?
Yes, thank you. I think coming back to the heading of our panel, we need to build up an ecosystem of trust, but in a dual sense of the phrase. So first of all, we need to make sure that those affected by AI can trust that their physical integrity and fundamental rights are not put at risk. But equally, we need to create trust on the part of those developing and deploying AI that they find an innovation-friendly climate in Europe, and that Europe is the place for them to engage in research and development.
Excellent, lovely and succinct. Thank you very much. And Ursula?
Yes, thank you very much. Let me also maybe put up front something positive, which is that from the survey that I mentioned of European consumers, we see that consumers have actually very high expectations when it comes to AI systems. They say that could be very useful to predict traffic accidents or to do health diagnoses, etc., etc. So they have high expectations. When it comes to the marks they give to the things that they experience, the marks are very low and the concerns are high. So I think that should be a clear incentive for the business community to say, okay, we can show to consumers what is really the added value. And let me just make one remark also on what Ms. Love said, because I would say that digital transition, which is led currently by these super huge companies and very rich companies, it has really not now, the last couple of years, gone in the direction that it would really be in line with the European values, if I may. So there is huge concern with regards to our society, our democracy, and the way we develop. And I think that startup and innovation is very good and needed, but it needs direction, as I think Andrea said so well earlier on. So I think that is really, again, we must be assertive with putting the right legal framework in place. And many times it's really about legal certainty, and it's updating and making effective what we already have in place in terms of protections. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Cecilia, last words are yours.
Thank you. I don't want to repeat what I said before, only to say that I think we need to get started. I don't think we're ready to regulate in a horizontal manner, and I totally agree with the evidence and risk-based approach. If we should identify a fundamental risk, of course we should cover them, but let's actually identify them first. Having said that, I hope that the next time we discuss this, we will discuss that we are now having a recovery fund on 750 billion from the European Commission, and 20% will go into digital. I hope that we will be discussing what are the AI products or projects that we would like to see really launched across Europe to benefit our citizens, our consumers, our companies, to really build a competence within Europe in the areas that we feel is fundamental to the citizens, that being health, that being energy consumption. And I really think it's some of the things that we need to look at in a recovery fund. And I hope that this is also something that we will discuss across the member states, across the different NGOs, across businesses and governments, and really get it right and learn how to actually build some of the future, not only avoid it.
Thank you, and good to know that recovery fund is there. It'll be interesting to hear the discussions in about a year's time. Thank you very much to all our panelists. I know that we just wanted to carry on talking. Your final statements prompted more thoughts and more questions, so thank you all very much. That was a really good, insightful discussion. Now it's time for the audience to get to work again quite shortly. There are going to be some breakout sessions. The details are on the slide. A quick reminder, We have 4 workshops: biometric identification, why, yes, how, no, or know how, requirements for trustworthy AI, conformity assessment, standards and high-risk AI applications, and AI and liability. And you can find links to join the sessions in the online agenda as well. So the breakout sessions start at 16:15 sharp. So your moderators will see you then. Thank you very much, everybody. See you later.